Welcome back to my channel. The narrative we encounter while playing video games is frequently what comes to mind when we consider their stories. However, what about everything around you? Everything you learn while playing a game about the world, people, and history. We'll look at 10 games with incredible lore today. Starting off with number 10 is the Dark Souls series. What first comes to mind when you think about video game lore? It's Dark Souls for me. It's strange because there aren't many books or notes to read through, in contrast to the majority of other lore-heavy games. Very little information is provided, and what is extremely unclear and confusing. However, that's what draws so many players into the game's lore. The players are not spoon-fed anything. Although many players find immense joy in exploring a densely populated kingdom and putting together the actual plot, you can choose to completely disregard the history and lore and just destroy stuff. It's incredible how much lore is covered in the first cutscene of the first Dark Souls game. When you first start playing the game, it hardly matters because it explains everything, including the appearance of the Dark Soul and the battle between the gods and dragons, among many other things. You don't even realize how crucial all that exposition was or is until you're about halfway through the game if you want to know what the heck is supposed to be going on. You learn everything there is to know about the world via speaking with NPCs, save from the opening story dump. That's environmental storytelling and the brief descriptions that accompany the majority of the gear and goods you purchase. Additionally, it is so brief and haphazard that it is simple to brush off as filler at first, but upon closer inspection, there are links galore. Though it rarely matters, knowing this information does make the experience more richer. It makes meeting Artorias the Abyss Walker so much more impactful when you know who he is. That's why the Dark Souls mythology is so captivating. It's vague enough to let the player's imagination run wild, yet it's detailed enough that you can see how the past permeates the game environment. It was a mind-blowing epiphany the first time I arrived in Anor Londo and realized this was the location of the City of the Gods they had spoken about at the beginning. Since then, the mystique around this series has captivated me.
Those who would link the fire.
At number 9 is Mass Effect. Furthermore, Mass Effect's lore handling is as dissimilar to Dark Souls as it gets. It's easy to understand, concisely stated, and available through an in-game encyclopedia. Even if the past has some rather intriguing secrets, the mystery itself doesn't always make it as mind-blowing. However, I think it's so fantastic because it's simply well made. There are a lot of fascinating things happening in the fantastic science fiction universe that is Mass Effect. Every species in the game has some fascinating aspect about them, be it their relationships or politics, or even more commonplace things like their food and life cycles. It's obvious that a great deal of effort went into building this world, and the wealth of information and backstory in Mass Effect helps to elevate the game's narrative above that of a typical sci-fi shooter. Whatever you think of the game's actual plots, this game is made so much better by the history and backstories that are infused into each race and character. It's also really great to be able to access everything by simply opening the in-game encyclopedia. Just browsing through the codex can take hours, and it's a truly fun activity. The voice and the calming background music greatly enhance the experience, and the information is concise but informative. It's enjoyable to discover the backstory in this series, and the developers do a fantastic job of fusing all of that lore into the gameplay. The story revolves around elements like the Genophage and the Geth-Quarian conflict, and I doubt that most gamers would be as involved if they hadn't done such a great job setting things up. People are excited for Mass Effect 4, despite the highly contentious ending of Mass Effect 3 and the letdown of Mass Effect Andromeda, in large part due to the universe and narrative developed by BioWare. There's a reason it's well liked, so maybe they can turn things around for the upcoming match. At number 8 is The Legend of Zelda. For a very long time, most people believed that The Legend of Zelda was nothing more than a series of disparate experiences with a few repeating themes. A few fans conjectured that there might be a connection between all the games, but it was all just fan fiction until Nintendo published the book Hyrule Historia in 2011, which included a chronological account of the Zelda series and proved there was in fact a connection between the games. They were related even though they were occasionally separated by hundreds or even thousands of years. The Legend of Zelda lore is so amazing because, although there were some successors that were already well known to fans, such as Zelda 2 being a direct sequel to Zelda 1, and Link's Adventure on the Game Boy being a sequel to Link to the Past, there were other games that seemed out of place, like Wind Waker with its endless ocean. In Hyrule's past, an event seems to be constant repeatedly for no apparent cause. There's a villain named Ganondorf, a princess named Zelda, a hero named Link who wears green tunics, and this superpower called the Triforce. Though the actual events in each game can differ greatly from one another, these are the common aspects that appear to occur repeatedly, even when the events take place decades or centuries apart. Even though the chronology ignores some consistencies, there exist split timelines to explain some inconsistencies, which further complicates matters. Even accepting that the same thing keeps happening repeatedly doesn't truly explain the full situation if you give it too much thought. It's kind of mind-blowing to realize that the first Legend of Zelda game on the NES is among the last games in the history, especially when the narrative suggests that it only occurs because the Hero of Time truly lost during the events of Ocarina of Time. Since Breath of the Wild is now the series' canonically final game, the chronology should, at the very least, start to become a little clearer going forward.
Stop him.
At number 7 is the Witcher series. It makes sense that the Witcher game series had such deep and complicated backstory, given that it was originally based on a number of novels and short stories. You have a different relationship to it than, say, Mass Effect, where your character frequently deals with the political issues of the universe, or the Witcher series. Rather than actively participating in what's happening, you're frequently just a guest. Even if you wind up dealing with significant world-changing events, Geralt is different in that he's typically just trying to remain out of it. Geralt views himself as neutral to a fault. Although the backdrop has a lot of interesting political stuff going on, you play as a regular guy who just wants to kill monsters. While all of the present events are fascinating in and of itself, the conjunction of the spheres is definitely the most astounding aspect of the history. You see, all of the monsters and creatures that the Witcher truly hunts, along with magic and other unusual phenomena, were brought into the world during this massive catastrophic event that occurred in the distant past when alternate worlds merged into one. The fact that the monsters you pursue in this series are essentially aliens is fairly weird in and of itself. Even more bizarre is the fact that, at least in the eyes of the dwarves and elves, humans were not the original inhabitants of this planet. They were essentially barbarians who arrived just during the conjunction and destroyed the ancient civilizations of the non-human races who had once inhabited this planet. It's a really interesting backstory that borders on science fiction for what is otherwise a primarily low-fantasy environment. In general, the Witcher environment is incredibly intriguing and well-developed, with a wealth of fascinating people and unrevealed backstories that give Geralt's exploits a great deal of depth.
Geralt of Rivia, the White Wolf.
At number 6 is the Destiny series. Here's a series where the lore and the games themselves differ really significantly. It's acceptable that the majority of casual Destiny 2 players likely know very nothing about the game's plot, concepts, or the numerous fascinating secrets buried deep within the mythologies. That's part of the charm of Destiny's lore, really. The game itself is not at all necessary to play, and you may manage without it. But all this lore actually extends the plot in fascinating ways for those who truly dive into it. Therefore, even while certain things, like the Red War campaign in Destiny 2, which isn't even playable anymore, can seem a little cliched and dull, the actual narrative is actually well done. The recent seasons preceding the Witch Queen edition, in my opinion, do a fantastic job of fusing the game's external lore with the gameplay for those who are more interested in the lore. Not to mention that the Fallen expansion has an extensive in-game narrative section. Places like the Dreaming City also contributed significantly to the game's lore. For a considerable amount of time, playing Destiny seemed like playing two different games. That is how disconnected the legend was from reality. It's nice that Bungie has been able to more organically weave all this knowledge into the game recently, as the story of the Darkness, the Traveler, and the other alien races, especially the Vex, is quite captivating. At number 5 is the Remedy Shared Universe. Developers of Max Payne 1 and 2, Alan Wake, and Control Remedy have always told excellent stories. Having a unique humorous edge and occasionally breaking the fourth wall, they were among the first in the industry to actually take story in video games seriously. They don't hesitate to take huge risks as game developers, and with Control, they took a very, very big risk. The setting of the heavily lore-filled game Control is a hybrid of the X-Files and the SCP Foundation, with a hint of Twin Peaks weirdness tossed in. The Federal Bureau of Control's headquarters, known as Oldest House, is where you spend the whole game investigating. It is filled with notes and video files that provide context for the peculiar history of the structure. If you're a fan of Alan Wake, you soon start collecting notes about recognizable places along the road. They make reference to Bright Falls and characterize the events that transpired there as another altered world occurrence. In actuality, Control and Alan Wake shared the same reality. The remastered version of Alan Wake and a later DLC built upon it, even including a Control Easter egg that further connects the two series. It's astonishing that there is a shared universe for Remedy at all. It significantly deepens the mystery of both games and increases our curiosity about what might occur in Alan Wake 2. At number 4 is the Nier series. Nier has some of the most insane mythology of any game. This series, after all, begins as a continuation of a hidden ending to a totally different series and jumps ahead more than a millennium to 3361, when the game appears to be set in a post-apocalyptic 2049. The fact that this series is essentially a covert extension of the Drakengard games is absurd. The first game in that series already had a crazy enough ending where your dragon rider from a fantasy alternate universe version of Europe arrives through a portal and ends up in the real-world version of Tokyo before getting unceremoniously killed by a cruise missile. That is the story behind Nier, a catastrophe that almost wiped off humanity and introduced magic into the real world. There's a lot going on in the first Nier game, but I won't even try to explain the complete plot because it's so intricate. But with Nier Automata, the sequel, things only become wilder. Why? Considering that Automata is set about 10,000 years later. For that game, they designate the year 11,945. We're talking about that far into the future, and a lot of weird things have happened since then. In this universe, which exists in between the games, the tale goes something like this. After humanity vanishes, aliens conquer Earth and establish a whole machine race to serve them. Later, all the aliens are wiped out by their own inventions. Really, you only play a little portion of the universe of this game. There is a ton of strange events that happened in the period described in the Nier Wiki. The dark, strange, and even comically ridiculous nature of the Nier universe adds to its allure. At number 3 is the Kirby series. This is the one series, if there is one, that I never would have guessed to have profound lore. Yes, we are referring to the Kirby video game franchise, in which players take control of a small pink ball and defeat opponents. These games contain some of the most intricate lore of any Nintendo franchise, for whatever reason. It's also something that's very simple to overlook if you're just casually playing these games, but if you've been a fan of the series for a while, it's difficult to overlook the small elements that are referenced in later titles. Actually, I came to the game somewhat late, but it was in Planet Robobot that I became aware of the substantial amount of lore present. When you deal enough damage to Stardream, the planet-sized supercomputer you battle against at the end of the game, it will transform into a creature that resembles the Galaxy Nova from Kirby Superstar. I'm not sure why the developers felt the need to include this kind of mythology in the series, but it makes for an interesting read. If you truly want to research it, there's a startling amount of dark and bizarre information to be found. It's kind of amazing that Kirby has any legend at all, but the fact that it's so well concealed and abundant only makes finding it harder. At number 2 is Bloodborne. Of course, having 2 From Software titles on this list is a bit of cheating, but Bloodborne's narrative has become incredibly popular. It's one game, but it's some of the creepiest, most enigmatic, and most mind-bending stuff available. The game's themes of humanity's nearly self-destructive search for meaning in an indifferent cosmos are what make the lore hunt in this game so fulfilling. Even though there are no clear solutions, nobody seems to care. The game is essentially laughing in your face as you attempt to piece together this strange plot. A fascinating aspect of Bloodborne is that your character accumulates insight as you progress through the game, which is essentially a measure of how much you learn about the underlying nature of reality. According to the narrative, everything begins fairly simply at first, with you chasing werewolves and other gloomy animals, but eventually the curtain of reality begins to break, and you begin to witness increasingly strange things. Both the game and its lore get increasingly abstract. It's difficult to determine what is even supposed to be genuine, because everything is so hazy and muddled with metaphors, and your thoughts seem to get stranger the more you think about the game. All of this is to say that Bloodborne is a truly unique game, in which the lore does a fantastic job of placing the player in the shoes of the characters. When people talk about the lore of this game, they come out as weirdos who live in the world and murmur to themselves about the eyeballs inside their minds like lunatics. It truly pushes the secrets of the Dark Souls series to a new level, which is pretty damn astounding in and of itself. Few games have lore as terrifying but captivating as this one. And finally, at number 1 is the Elder Scrolls series, particularly the more unusual older items. Really, did you think we would omit the Elder Scrolls series from this list? There are no other series with as much rich, complex, and varied backstory as this one. There are two amazing things about the lore of this game series. It's abundant, to start with. These things can get really damn long because books are everywhere, each with several pages, and frequently multiple volumes of the same story. The game and the mount are insane. Just one game out of the 820 unique literary works that are available has 307 novels that are only meant for lore. The Elder Scrolls series is far longer than anything else available on word count alone, but it's not only about quantity or quality. The majority of it is fantastic and generally well written. It can also go quite insane when it wants to. You can find out so many incredible tiny facts by yourself, such as the fact that the two moons aren't really moons, but rather the remains of a deceased god, and that even though they appear to be moons, their genuine forms are beyond the reach of our human vision. That's true series lore, folks. Another absurd one. If you've played these games, you probably already know about the Dwemer and their robots, which are still present in many ancient ruins. But did you know that the lore also contains even more advanced creatures, such as sunbirds, which were created from the sun itself and were able to travel through space and collect celestial minerals? Like really, that exists in this world. This is a crazy series where the premise is that you can practically become Chim from the Matrix. Look at whatever Michael Kirkblade wrote from Oblivion if you want to become really deep with your Elder Scrolls lore. The 36 Lessons of Vivec are particularly esoteric and extremely psychedelic. The lore in the Elder Scrolls series is extensive and encompasses all possible desires. It's dense, brilliantly written, and packed with content. When it wants to, it can get really crazy. All of that for now. Tell us what you think by leaving a comment. Click like if you enjoy this video. Now is a fantastic time to subscribe if you haven't already. Of course, subscribing is the best way to view them first, so click that button. Thank you so much for viewing this video as always, and don't forget to enable all alerts.